Hi there, it's Clyde, and I'm glad you're here. Before we settle in together, I just want to remind you that I have an entire playlist full of these sleepy little time-traveling adventures, and if you enjoy this one, even just a little bit, I'd love if you'd like the video and subscribe right now. That way, you won't forget when you start to drift off. And if you really like these stories and want your very own sleepy tale made just for you, consider becoming a channel member. It helps support the channel and lets me send a drowsy little story straight to you with your name and your favorite setting tucked right in. Now then, tonight's story takes us to a windmill in the soft, quiet countryside of the Netherlands, where I forget what I was doing actually. Something with grain, or gears. Maybe I was helping with flour, or just watching. The sails turn slowly and everything moves like it's half underwater. You'll see what I mean soon enough. Let's begin. The first thing I remember is the ladder. It was wooden and wobbly and leaned ever so slightly to the left, like it had grown tired of standing straight all these years and decided to rebel just a little bit, but not so much that anyone would fix it. At the bottom of the ladder, there were muddy boots. Mine, I think. And next to the boots, an empty basket with a broken handle and a pear inside. Not a fresh pear either. The kind that's gone slightly grainy and has a soft bruise shaped vaguely like a rabbit. I had one foot on the second rung and my hand around a thick hemp rope that led upward into the wooden belly of the windmill. It creaked somewhere above me, turning slowly in the breeze, and as I tilted my head up, I could see the gears moving, thick, heavy wooden teeth sliding past one another like tired old men shaking hands. Birds. There were birds outside, chattering. Probably sparrows, but maybe not. They might have been starlings or warblers. I'm not much good at bird names unless they're doing something unusually bird-like. The sun was out, but not enthusiastically. Just enough to light the tops of the grass and cast a soft golden fuzz along the edges of the fields. I climbed up slowly, not because I was afraid, but because it seemed wrong to rush. Everything around the windmill moved slowly, and it felt like I might tear the whole thing in half if I went too fast. There was a bag of something leaning against the wall on the second landing. Flour, maybe. Or oats. I didn't look. It had a small tear and something had spilled out, forming a kind of miniature sand dune with what I think was a toothpick sticking out of the top like a flagpole. I sat down on a bench that didn't match the rest of the structure. It was painted blue, badly, and the paint was flaking like fish scales. The cushion was lumpy and slightly damp, and there was a smell, fresh bread and old rope. I pulled a tiny notebook out of my pocket. It had exactly one drawing in it, a goat wearing spectacles. No words, just the goat. I'm still not sure if I drew it or found it that way. And then I just sat and listened to the gears. They made a sound like a sleepy yawn if yawns had elbows. Time passed in the lazy way it does when there's nothing at all urging it along. I found myself wondering about the pigeons I'd seen earlier and whether or not they minded the spinning sails. One of them had been wearing a red thread around its foot. I imagined it was part of a pigeon messenger service, though it might have just flown through a child's craft table. Either way, it was probably important to someone. The sails outside creaked gently, swinging through the air like they were stirring soup. And I let my eyes drift closed, not to sleep, not yet. Just to think without distractions. Like why there was a single spoon nailed to the wall near the window. It had the word Garrett carved into the handle. I don't know a Garrett, at least not yet. There was a man. I didn't see him at first. I heard him before I saw him. His shoes squeaked, not in a dramatic, showy way, but more like the sound a mouse would make if it were trying to walk on custard. The windmill's gears made enough noise that you wouldn't normally notice squeaky shoes. But this place had a way of drawing attention to the smallest things, like how the dust on the window looked like a tiny map of the Rhine, or how a spider had spun a nearly perfect spiral web right across the top of a scoop shovel someone had hung on a nail and forgotten. Anyway, squeaky shoes. He came up the same ladder I'd used, though he climbed it with more confidence and noticeably more speed. He was wearing a green knit hat with a pom-pom on top and a coat with mismatched buttons, one of them shaped like a duck. He carried a small brass telescope that had no glass in either end, and when he saw me sitting on the bench, he paused like he was trying to remember if we'd met before. "I'm Willem," he said. I nodded. "That's a nice notebook." I looked at the goat sketch. "Thanks," I said. He sat down on a grain sack and didn't say anything else for a while. That was fine. A fly buzzed in slow loops around the window and eventually settled on the spoon with Gerrit's name etched into the handle. "You know," Willem said after a while, "this windmill's been here since 1682. I didn't know. He tapped his telescope against his knee like he was playing a drum. "Used to grind rye, then barley, then tourists." I blinked. He grinned. "Kidding. Just checking if you were still awake." We listened to the gears turn again. They made that same yawning sound, like a sleepy lion turning over in bed. "Used to be 8 windmills out here," Willem said. "Only 3 now." "What happened to the others?" I asked. He shrugged. "Blew away, or retired." He set the telescope on the windowsill, then took a small pastry out of his pocket. It looked like it had been sat on twice. "You want half?" I shook my head. He nodded as if that was the right choice. "I only come Tuesdays," he said with his mouth full. "The pigeons get nervous otherwise." That made as much sense as anything. He offered me a raisin from the pastry, but it rolled off his finger and bounced once before falling into the grain pile. He looked at it like he might go after it, then didn't. Outside, the sails creaked again. One of them had a strip of faded cloth tied near the tip. "Used to be a signal," Willem said, "for the bargemen. Let them know the mill was working." I imagined a slow boat moving along the canal, a man squinting up at the windmill with a pipe clenched between his teeth, nodding once before continuing on. We didn't talk after that. The gears turned. The fly left the spoon. The raisin stayed lost. Willem left eventually. Said he had to go check on something called the cabbage arrangement, which sounded either delicious or highly classified. He tucked the spyglass into a small velvet pouch and gave a little wave as he disappeared down the ladder, squeaks echoing behind him like a farewell song played by a tiny clarinet. Once he was gone, the windmill felt a little emptier, but in a peaceful sort of way. I wandered over to the other side of the main floor, past the gears and the grain sacks, and discovered a small door I hadn't noticed before. It was just tall enough for someone slightly shorter than me to pass through without bumping their head, so naturally I bumped my head. Inside was a room with no windows and exactly 3 things: a wooden chair, a single leather shoe, a jar filled with buttons. Now, the buttons were mostly ordinary. Shirt buttons, coat buttons, one very large one shaped like a cat's face, and a few that looked like they'd been hand-carved from bone or shell. I don't know why they were in the jar, but it was a good jar, heavy glass with a thick lid and some kind of waxy seal that had mostly cracked away. The shoe. Well, the shoe was mysterious. It was left-footed, a little worn, and stuffed with crumpled paper. Not newspaper, just paper. One sheet had the word Wednesday written on it. Another said, "Ask Anton." I don't know any Antons either, and there wasn't a matching shoe. I picked it up and gave it a sniff, which in hindsight was probably not necessary, but it didn't smell bad. Just old, like an attic that's never had any drama. The chair creaked when I sat down, which felt like a good sign. From this little hidden room, the sound of the windmill's gears was muffled, softer, more distant, like it was being filtered through a wool blanket and half a memory. There was a small nail driven into the far wall, and dangling from it was a key. Just one. It had no label. I didn't touch it. Sometimes things are better left hanging. I opened the jar of buttons and stirred them gently with one finger. The cat-faced one stared up at me with smug indifference. That's when I realized I'd been humming. I didn't even know the tune, something old and slow, maybe made up. When I left the room, I placed the shoe on the chair and gave the buttons a parting glance, then closed the door gently behind me, as if it might disturb whatever story was still tucked inside. Later in the afternoon, when the light coming through the dusty windows turned that buttery gold color that makes everything feel like it's part of a painting, I found the calendar. It was tacked up beside a wooden beam, curled at the corners and slightly tilted, as though the windmill itself had sighed and the paper had shifted in response. It wasn't a modern calendar, not the glossy kind with kittens or famous quotes or recipes for seasonal soups. This one was hand-drawn. Each square had a date in tidy script, and then, instead of holidays or appointments, it listed things like button counting, full moon, elbow oiling, skip if raining, speak to rooster, read boundaries, bread day, with a question mark that made me feel uncertain about everything. There was no year printed, no month either, just a cycle of days. One square near the middle had been shaded in with cross-hatching, and next to it was a doodle of what might have been a turnip or a confused balloon. Underneath it said, "Do not wind the clock today," which naturally made me wonder what would happen if someone did wind the clock. But there wasn't a clock, at least not that I could see. Unless they meant the pocket watch I always wear, but that was already ticking along at its own sleepy pace, tucked into my cloak like a gentle reminder that time was optional. A breeze made the calendar flutter, and for a moment I imagined it whispering, not actual words, just a suggestion. I traced my finger over one of the entries. Check cellar for the goat. There it was again. A goat. First the sketch in the notebook. Then this. No cellar, though, not one I'd found. Maybe that was the real mystery of this place. An invisible cellar and an imaginary goat having deep philosophical debates just beneath our feet. I took the calendar down carefully and flipped it over. On the back was a crude drawing of the windmill itself, but with 8 sails instead of 4, and beneath it, written in tiny cursive, "Turn once for flower, twice for remembering," which made absolutely no sense. And yet somehow it made me feel a little better, like the windmill knew things I didn't, important things, but not in any hurry to explain them. Back near the central beam, just to the left of the big gear that looked like a bread slicer for giants, there was a rope. It wasn't connected to anything obvious. It just dangled, thick, frayed at the end and swinging slightly in the draft that moved through the mill like it had somewhere to be but wasn't in a rush. Naturally, I tugged it. It didn't resist. It didn't lift anything or ring a bell or open a trap door. It simply moved. About a meter of it came loose, and then it stopped, like a very patient dog being walked by an extremely indecisive person. I looked up. Nothing. Just wooden beams and dust motes and the occasional bit of straw that drifted down like a feather with low self-esteem. I tied the rope into a loose knot, mostly because it felt like something I ought to do, and sat back on a nearby sack of grain, which puffed a little plume of flour into the air. Now I was slightly dusted. Looked like a baker who'd just lost an argument with a bag of dough. I rested one hand on the rope and let my eyes follow it upward again. And that's when I saw the label. It was carved, very faintly, into the beam above. Try again tomorrow. which was exactly the kind of thing that sounded either deeply philosophical or entirely unhelpful. Maybe both. I scratched my head. Behind me, the gears shifted slightly, releasing a deep thunk like the world exhaling. That's when I noticed a tiny shelf built into the wall behind the rope. It was no wider than a hand, and on it sat a jar of mustard, half full, sealed with wax, and labeled simply, "For Willem, if he remembers." Well, Willem hadn't mentioned mustard, but to be fair, we hadn't covered condiments. I left it there, didn't open it. I figured if Willem ever remembered, he'd know just where to look. And if he didn't, well, that's mustard for you. There was a teacup, perched on a high shelf just above eye level and partially hidden behind a rolled-up map of the local dikes and canals. It wasn't dusty like the other things. In fact, it looked suspiciously clean, like it had just been placed there moments ago by someone very deliberate, or a time-traveling raccoon with a refined palate. It was porcelain, white with pink flowers around the rim and a little green vine curling down the side. There was a tiny chip on the handle, shaped almost exactly like the crescent moon. I stood on my toes to get a better look, nudging the map aside. The cup was sitting on a folded linen napkin. Underneath the napkin, of course, was another note, because everything here had layers. The note read, "This isn't yours, but it's safe here." I turned the cup slowly in my hand. It felt warm, not hot, just as if it had recently held tea. There was no saucer, no matching spoon, no kettle in sight, just the cup. And somehow, it didn't feel like part of the windmill. It was too delicate, too hopeful, like it belonged to someone who believed in midday dreams and floral embroidery. I sat back down on the blue bench and held the teacup in my lap. The sails creaked overhead. The light through the window had shifted to that very specific late afternoon honey color that makes everything feel wrapped in gauze. And I remembered something. Not a fact, just a feeling. Of sitting at a different table, in a different place, where someone poured tea and talked about button collections and the smell of rain on warm stone. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was just the windmill playing tricks again. But either way, the teacup stayed with me a while, even after I put it back. Carefully. Back on its napkin, just where it didn't belong, but felt right anyway. The duck came in around sunset. I didn't see it arrive, just heard the flap of wings, then the soft, purposeful patter of webbed feet on the wooden floorboards. It waddled halfway up the central platform, paused like it was thinking very hard about its next step, then made its way to the open window and stood perfectly still, staring out. I didn't say anything right away. There was something almost sacred about the moment, like interrupting it might ruin the whole balance of the windmill. But eventually, I gave a gentle nod and said, "Evening." The duck did not respond, which is fair. It's not obligated to. It had a soft, speckled body and what looked like a small piece of straw stuck to one side. Its beak twitched just slightly as the breeze came through the window, and I got the distinct feeling it was judging me, but only a little. I wondered if it belonged to someone, or if, like me, it was just passing through. "There's mustard," I offered, motioning vaguely toward the shelf. Still no response. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small biscuit I'd forgotten about. It was slightly crumbled and smelled faintly of rosemary. The duck turned, took 2 steps forward, then turned back to the window as if to say, "Not now. I'm thinking." A cloud passed in front of the sun, and the light inside the windmill shifted. Everything glowed a little softer, a little slower. Eventually, the duck fluffed its feathers, gave a single quack so soft it felt like punctuation, and hopped up onto the windowsill. It stayed there for a minute, watching the sails turn. Then it was gone. Just like that. No grand exit. Just air and wings and a faint suggestion of direction. I looked down at the biscuit in my hand. A crumb fell to the floor, and I realized, not for the first time, that time doesn't always move forward in places like this. Sometimes it just circles. There was one gear in the windmill that didn't match the rest. It was smaller, flatter, and painted red. Not bright red, but a faded, stubborn kind of red, like it had been important once and then slowly stopped trying to impress anyone. It didn't move, at least not with the others. When the main shaft turned and the massive wooden cogs shifted with their sleepy yawns and steady clunks, this one just sat there. Still, unbothered. I asked Willem about it once. Weeks later, in a completely different time and place. We were sitting in the shadow of a tree shaped like a teapot, watching some sheep who seemed like they were up to something. "Oh, that one," he'd said. "Nobody touches that gear. Been that way since the fog year." I never found out what the fog year was. But here, now, I knelt in front of it, brushing off a bit of lint that had settled on the rim. The rest of the windmill was gently rumbling with movement, but this gear was listening. I could feel it. There was something behind it, or beneath it, or around it. A memory, maybe, or a warning. There was a tiny nail hammered into the wall just above it, and dangling from the nail was a wooden tag that said simply, "This gear dreams." I didn't want to wake it, so I stood back up and gave it a small nod. The kind of nod you give to someone on the bus you don't really know but recognize from somewhere. And then I left it alone, because sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for a dreamer is let them keep dreaming. The door creaked open just as the sky turned that silvery color you only get when the sun is thinking about leaving but hasn't quite made up its mind. And in stepped someone I hadn't expected. Vincent van Gogh. At least I think it was him. It wasn't like he said, "Hi, I'm Vincent." He just walked in like he'd always been part of the place, wearing a worn coat with smudges of blue and ochre on the cuffs and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything all at once. He didn't say a word, just looked around, slowly, as though cataloguing every splinter and shadow. He paused near the spoon on the wall, tilted his head, gave it a tiny nod. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of canvas, unfolded it gently on the blue bench, and studied it with such intensity that even the gears seemed to slow down a little, out of respect. It was a painting of the windmill, but not exactly this windmill. It had more light in it, brighter colors, more movement, and a rooster. In the painting there was a red rooster standing at the top of the stairs, next to a pail of water. I checked the stairs. No rooster, no pail, just dust, and a button. He tapped the painting once with a paint-stained finger, looked up at me, and finally said, "Nearly finished?" I nodded. Because what else do you say to that? He folded the canvas again, tucked it back into his coat, and walked slowly around the room, trailing his fingers across the wall as if reading the wood by touch. When he got to the mustard jar, he chuckled. Not in a mocking way, more like someone recognizing an old friend in a surprising place. Then he left. No explanation, no brush with genius. Just a quiet man with paint under his fingernails and thoughts too big for the room. And somehow, after he was gone, the windmill felt a little brighter, like it had been remembered. I was leaning against one of the support beams when I felt it. Not a vibration exactly, more like a change in stillness, a shift in the quiet. I reached into the inside pocket of my cloak and felt the smooth curve of the stone. It was always there, always warm, always still, until it wasn't. It didn't glow, not brightly, just a faint hum beneath the surface, like a memory trying to rise to the top of a dream. I didn't look at it right away. Instead, I sat back down on the blue bench and let my eyes wander across the room one more time. The spoon on the wall, the jar of buttons, the rope that went nowhere, the red gear that dreamt, the painting that wasn't finished, and the place where the duck had been. Everything in this windmill felt like it was exactly where it needed to be, even if no one fully understood why. I stood and dusted a bit of flour off my knees, then wandered to the window. The sails outside turned slowly in the soft breeze, not rushing, just doing what they do. I held the stone in both hands now. Its warmth pulsed gently, once, twice, then paused, like it was waiting for me to decide. And maybe I did, or maybe it decided for me, because the next thing I remember was the faintest glow curling around the edges of my vision, soft blue, like twilight through glass, and the feeling of falling upward, like a sigh that turned into a question. I didn't say goodbye, because the windmill wasn't going anywhere. It would still be there, gears yawning, sails turning, and somewhere, a teacup sitting quietly, right where it didn't belong, and maybe, just maybe, the goat had finally been found.